At 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Air Transat Flight 236 was exactly where a long-haul passenger aircraft was supposed to be. The Airbus A330 was flying from Toronto to Lisbon, thousands of feet above a dark ocean that stretched beyond the windows in every direction. Below the aircraft, there was no city, no highway, and no airport waiting nearby. There was only the Atlantic. And at first, nothing seemed unusual. But somewhere inside the aircraft, a fuel leak had already begun. The pilots did not know it yet. The passengers certainly did not know it. And for the next several hours, the aircraft would continue flying toward Europe, while slowly losing the one thing it could not survive without: fuel. On the 23rd of August, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 was prepared for a routine overnight journey from Toronto Pearson International Airport to Lisbon, Portugal. The Airbus A330 was relatively new, only about 2 years old. Its captain, Robert Piché, was 48 years old and had accumulated roughly 16,000 hours of flight experience. His first officer, Dirk DeJager, was 28 and had around 5,000 hours of experience, including several hundred hours on the A330. There was nothing unusual about the crew. There was nothing obviously wrong with the aircraft. And the flight itself was expected to be routine. Nearly 300 passengers boarded the aircraft along with the crew. The plane was loaded with enough fuel for the transatlantic journey, and after the final checks were completed, Flight 236 departed Toronto shortly after 8 p.m. local time. The aircraft climbed steadily. Within minutes, it reached its cruising altitude. For the passengers, the journey quickly settled into the familiar rhythm of an overnight flight. Cabin lights dimmed. People went to sleep. Meals were served. And somewhere, high above the ocean, the Airbus continued eastward under autopilot. For the pilots, however, a long flight is never completely routine. Even when the autopilot is handling most of the aircraft's movements, the crew constantly monitors engines, fuel, navigation, weather, electrical systems, and dozens of other parameters. For the first several hours, everything appeared normal. Then, roughly 4 hours into the flight, the crew noticed something strange. One of the aircraft's engine indications did not make sense. The problem involved the right engine, engine number 2. The cockpit instruments were showing an unusual combination of oil pressure, oil quantity, and temperature readings. The numbers suggested that something might be wrong with the engine's oil system. But there was a problem. The pilots had never seen this particular combination of indications before. They consulted the aircraft's manuals, looking for an explanation or a procedure they could follow. They found nothing that clearly matched what they were seeing. So they contacted Air Transat's maintenance personnel on the ground in Canada. The maintenance team was also unable to immediately identify the cause. The recommendation was straightforward: continue monitoring the situation. At that point, there was no obvious loss of engine performance. The aircraft was still flying normally. There was no warning that suggested an immediate emergency. So the crew had little reason to believe that the strange readings were connected to anything more serious. Then another warning appeared. This time, it involved fuel. The crew noticed that the amount of fuel in the two wings was becoming unbalanced. Normally, fuel is distributed between the aircraft's tanks in a way that maintains the proper balance. If one side contains less fuel than the other, the crew can use the aircraft's cross-feed system to move fuel between the tanks. That was exactly what the pilots did. They opened the cross-feed system, allowing fuel from the left side to flow toward the right. For a moment, the numbers returned to normal. It looked as though the problem had been solved, but it hadn't. About 10 minutes later, another fuel warning appeared. The right side fuel quantity was falling again, and this time, the crew began to realize that the problem might not be a faulty instrument. Something was causing the aircraft to lose fuel. The implications were enormous. Flight 236 was crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The nearest suitable airport was the Portuguese island of Terceira in the Azores, but Terceira was still far away, and the aircraft was burning fuel every minute. The crew began communicating with air traffic control and evaluating their options. There was no convenient airport below them. There was no highway where they could put the aircraft down. There was only open ocean. The pilots needed to know how much fuel remained, and, more importantly, how quickly it was disappearing. They soon discovered that the rate of loss was extraordinary. The aircraft was losing fuel far faster than it should have been. At one point, the crew observed that approximately 1 metric ton of fuel could disappear in only a few minutes. The situation was no longer a technical irregularity. It was an emergency. The crew members were asked to look for signs of a leak around the aircraft's wing. But it was nighttime. The Atlantic Ocean below them was almost completely black. And from inside the aircraft, there was no obvious stream of fuel visible in the darkness. Still, the numbers inside the cockpit told a different story. The fuel was disappearing. The crew estimated that they had only a limited amount of time before the tanks would be empty. Terceira was their best hope, but reaching the island was far from guaranteed. The maintenance team suggested descending from 39,000 feet to a lower altitude in order to help investigate the situation. Captain Piché decided against immediately making that descent. At 39,000 feet, the aircraft possessed something extremely valuable: altitude. If the engines eventually stopped, that altitude could be converted into distance through a glide. Once the aircraft descended, that reserve of potential energy would be gone. The decision would later become one of the most important choices of the entire flight. Then, suddenly, the situation became unmistakable. The right engine failed. Flight 236 was now flying with only one engine, and the fuel leak was still active. The aircraft continued toward Terceira, but there was no longer any realistic possibility of simply continuing the flight normally. The crew declared an emergency. On Terceira, emergency personnel began preparing for the aircraft's arrival. Fire crews moved into position. Rescue teams prepared for the possibility of a crash. And inside Flight 236, hundreds of passengers were still unaware of how serious the situation had become. The aircraft continued forward. Its fuel quantity continued to fall. Eventually, only a small amount remained. Then the second engine began to fail. The left engine had been operating at high power, and now it too was affected by the consequences of the fuel shortage. There was nothing left for the engines to burn. Flight 236 had run out of fuel. Both engines stopped. For a passenger aircraft, this is one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Without engine thrust, an Airbus A330 cannot simply continue flying at its normal cruising altitude. But an aircraft does not instantly fall from the sky when its engines stop. It becomes a glider. And at that moment, the Airbus A330, carrying hundreds of people, became one of the largest gliders ever to be forced into an emergency landing. The cockpit became much quieter. The engines were gone. The aircraft's electrical systems were also affected, because much of the aircraft's normal electrical power comes from its engines. But the A330 had an emergency device designed for precisely this kind of situation: a ram air turbine, or RAT, automatically deployed into the airflow. The small turbine extracted energy from the moving air and provided enough emergency power to operate critical systems. The pilots still had control, but they had no engines, and they had no second chance. Terceira was still more than 100 kilometers away. The aircraft began descending. Captain Piché and First Officer DeJager now had to accomplish something that an Airbus A330 was never designed to do in normal airline service. They had to fly it to an airport without engine power. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly. Every minute mattered. Every control input mattered. Every decision had consequences. And there was no engine available to correct a mistake. The passengers gradually realized that something was seriously wrong. The cabin had become unusually quiet. Emergency procedures were being carried out. The crew began preparing passengers for the possibility of a ditching in the Atlantic. If the aircraft could not reach Terceira, the only remaining option would be to attempt an emergency landing on the ocean. That scenario carried enormous risks. Even if the aircraft survived the impact, the passengers would then face the dangers of the open sea, including waves, exposure, and the difficulty of rescuing hundreds of people from the water at night. But there was still a chance. The pilots had altitude, they had control of the aircraft, and they had an airport somewhere ahead of them. The question was whether they could reach it. As the Airbus descended, the pilots continuously adjusted their flight path. They could not simply point the aircraft toward the runway and descend at whatever rate they wanted. Too high, and they could overshoot. Too low, and they would never reach the airport. They had to manage altitude and distance, almost like a pilot flying a sailplane. The aircraft's airspeed was converted into the energy needed to keep it airborne. The nose had to be carefully controlled, the descent had to remain stable, and the runway had to appear in exactly the right place. As Flight 236 approached Terceira, the pilots faced another problem. They were still too high. The airport was getting closer, but the aircraft had more altitude than it could safely use during a normal approach. That might sound like a good problem to have. It wasn't. An aircraft without engines cannot simply slow down by reducing thrust. Because there is no thrust to reduce, the pilots needed to lose altitude without losing control of the aircraft or arriving too fast. So they began using a series of maneuvers to increase their flight path and consume altitude. At one point, the aircraft was close enough to the airport that Captain Piché performed a large turn. Then, as the runway became more reachable, the pilots used a series of S-turns. Instead of flying directly toward the runway, they deliberately increased the aircraft's horizontal path. The maneuver bought them something precious. Time every turn allowed the aircraft to lose more altitude while still remaining within reach of the airport. But the runway was approaching. There would be no second attempt. The landing itself was unlike anything the pilots normally performed. A commercial airliner landing under normal circumstances has engine thrust available to control speed and altitude. Flight 236 had none. The pilots had to rely almost entirely on the aircraft's remaining aerodynamic energy. As the runway came into view, Captain Piché lined up the aircraft. The Airbus descended toward Terceira. The runway was there, the aircraft was there, and for the first time since the engines had stopped, survival was beginning to look possible. But the landing was still extremely dangerous. The aircraft touched down hard. Several tires burst almost immediately. The landing gear was subjected to enormous forces. The pilots fought to keep the aircraft under control as it raced along the runway. The aircraft eventually came to a stop. A fire broke out around the landing gear, but emergency crews were already waiting. Firefighters rushed toward the aircraft. Rescue personnel moved in, and then, after one of the most extraordinary emergency flights in modern aviation, the passengers began leaving the Airbus. Some suffered injuries during the hard landing and evacuation, but the overwhelming fact remained: they had survived. Every person on that aircraft had just traveled across the Atlantic in a powerless passenger jet. Flight 236 had glided roughly 120 kilometers after losing both engines, covering the remaining distance to Terceira without engine thrust. The aircraft had effectively become a giant glider, carrying hundreds of people. The question that remained was simple: how had a modern Airbus, carrying what should have been more than enough fuel for its journey, managed to run completely dry in the middle of the Atlantic? The investigation eventually uncovered the answer. Before Flight 236 departed Toronto, maintenance work had been performed on the right engine. A component had been replaced, but the replacement component was not the correct one for that engine. The mismatch created a problem in the engine's fuel system. The connection was not properly suited to the aircraft's configuration, and vibration during flight eventually contributed to the failure of a nearby fuel line. Fuel began escaping from the aircraft. The strange oil indications the pilots had noticed earlier were not an unrelated mystery. They were connected to the mechanical problem developing inside the engine. The crew had been seeing clues, but the true nature of those clues was difficult to identify in real time. And that is what makes Flight 236 so remarkable. The pilots were not simply lucky. They had to interpret incomplete information, make decisions with limited options, preserve as much altitude as possible, communicate with air traffic control, manage a powerless aircraft, and then execute a landing under conditions that offered virtually no room for error. Captain Robert Piché's decision to preserve altitude became especially important. Had the aircraft descended earlier, it would have had less potential energy available when both engines eventually failed. Instead, the altitude gave the pilots a larger gliding range. That reserve helped transform what could have been an ocean disaster into an emergency landing. The incident also led to changes in aviation procedures and fuel leak detection. Airbus introduced measures intended to help crews identify abnormal fuel loss more effectively and reduce the likelihood that a similar failure could remain undetected during flight. For Captain Piché and First Officer DeJager, the flight became the defining event of their careers. A year later, both men were recognized with the Superior Airmanship Award for their handling of the powerless Airbus A330. But perhaps the most striking part of Flight 236 is not that the aircraft managed to glide. It is that the emergency developed slowly enough to give the crew a chance to understand what was happening, yet quickly enough to leave them almost no margin for error. There was no single moment when everything suddenly went wrong. Instead, the crisis unfolded through a series of small warnings: an unusual engine reading, an unexplained fuel imbalance, a warning message, a rapidly falling fuel quantity, a fire, one engine lost, then the other, and finally, silence. By the time the engine stopped, the aircraft was thousands of feet above the Atlantic, with hundreds of people depending on two pilots who had no engine power left to save them. They had only altitude, aerodynamic control, experience, and a runway somewhere ahead. Flight 236 is remembered as one of the most extraordinary examples of airmanship in commercial aviation. It is also a reminder that modern aircraft are not protected from every possible failure. Sometimes survival depends not on technology eliminating the danger, but on trained people recognizing the danger, understanding their options, and making the right decision when there may be only one opportunity left. On that August night in 2001, an Airbus A330 left Toronto bound for Lisbon. It never reached Portugal by air. Instead, after losing both engines over the Atlantic, it became an enormous glider and descended toward a small island in the Azores. And when its wheels finally touched the runway at Terceira, the aircraft was no longer simply completing a flight. It was completing one of the most remarkable emergency landings in the history of commercial aviation. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Nova Reports for more extraordinary stories from history, science, aviation, and the world around us. And if you want to see more documentaries like this, leave a comment below and tell us what story we should investigate next. Thanks for watching Nova Reports. Until next time, stay curious.